Today in Crazed Performance Repair, we're going to do something a little bit different than my usual video. We are actually addressing a basket case. Now, what is a basket case, you might be asking? Well, let's just say a customer called me up, said, my mechanic, he's not getting the work done that I want done. Can you help me? And what it was a engine job that needed to have rings gapped because of performance use on a Mercedes-Benz. So this Mercedes-Benz engine block came to me just like this, in pieces. That is the definition of basket case. So I told them I'm going to have to charge you the full, rebuild of the engine because I don't know what I'm getting involved in. But you guys get to come along for the ride and join me as I try and figure out how to reassemble this basket case. So stay tuned. So as you can see, I have a lot of parts down here. I never took any of this apart. I have not done one of these exact engines. I do have a general idea how it's going to go back together because I just kind of guessed off of what I've seen. And of course, I have diagrams available to me. But how am I going to take care of a basket case scenario such as this and assemble it in a somewhat timely manner, hopefully? So before I get started on that, though, what am I doing to this motor? So originally it came in with the factory pistons, factory rods. This was a replacement engine for the one that the guy had blown up. Now, this is I think a 2005 AMG. So it's a supercharged V8 engine. I think they're 5.5 liter if I recall correctly. But regardless, he wanted me originally to gap the rings. I asked a little backstory on why we're doing what we're doing, and basically it came down to he did an excessive amount of pulls in the car and ended up destroying his original engine. And this pan was from his original engine. It had just an absolute cake full of metal and debris and dust and whatnot sitting in the bottom of the pan. Now, all these parts that are here, I have taken to my local machine shop. Him and I have a good relationship. He has one of those CUDA machines where it's a stand-up parts washer with a big door, a rotating table, and a bunch of spray nozzles. So I had him run through, clean all the parts in that thing. I even had him do the crank, but I did that before taking the crank to get in for balance. Now, why am I balancing it? I convinced the customer to go away from the factory pistons, considering the circumstances, and go to an aftermarket performance piston, a nice forged piston. So what I'm going to be putting in are these CP Carrillo pistons. They have the coating on the skirts for the allofill cylinder bores that this particular engine has, and it is a much beefier, better looking piston. You can certainly tell by the bottom of this thing that it has a lot more bracing in better areas than the factory piston. And if we look over here, you can see it looks like an overall better piston, and it better be because it comes with one heck of a premium price tag. So because I'm upgrading the pistons, the factory pistons are actually heavier than the aftermarket performance pistons. So because they're heavier, I had to balance. Well, I recommended to balance. He could have got by without it. It wasn't a huge difference, but it probably would have had a real small shake, and it is a Benz. Why would you want to shake in a Benz? A Benz is supposed to be a smooth, perfect running machine. So he decided to go ahead and do the balance. It actually didn't cost that much, a couple $100. It wasn't that bad. All he had to do was remove a little weight from the counterweights on the crank. Nice, simple setup. And then, of course, on some of the rods, he had to balance them out a little bit too. So they have a little bit of a grind away on some of the ends, and it was the small end that he had to adjust the most. But he said that they actually weren't that bad compared to what he's used to seeing on, like, the domestic stuff, for instance. So everything has an equal weight. Everything is set up to work with this crank and the balancing assembly. Now, when he did bring this car in, this motor in, it did have the crank still in the block. So I was able to disassemble that part, but the rest of this, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know how this pump attaches. I don't know anything in that area. So when I got this engine in, technically I did have the crankshaft in there. So the main bearings were in it with the crankshaft. The rods they brought to me on the pistons. The rods still had the bearings in them. Theoretically, we're going to reuse these rod bearings, assuming that they clearance properly. I'm going to have to check the clearance, double check everything, because I did not pull these out, and perhaps somebody, the other guy, mix-matched. I have no idea the rod bearings. So I'm going to check those. I'm going to get this bottom end assembled, because that's the simple part. That's the part I don't need any books or anything to look at how to assemble it. I can figure that out on my own. I did mark each side of the piston, which is towards the front of the motor, because I was able to tell with the pistons themselves, they have a notch for front of engine. So I marked the rods to make them equal, and that way I can match them on the new pistons. So I'm going to go ahead, get started on the assembly, and in the meantime, I'm also going to be cleaning up all these parts. So let's go ahead and get started on that. And while I'm doing that, don't forget to leave a comment below if you like unusual videos like this. Also, be sure to like, share, subscribe if you find my content interesting. So as I'm looking at the engine specs on this particular engine, I had to look up where the ID number was. It was on the top of the motor. It's behind like the cylinder area up here. And this is a 113990 for the model number. So I have to look through the specs, and then there's these two categories. They give you these engines are this, and that other engine is this. Now this is a specific engine. There's only a few types of these, and that one, for instance, the oil squirters here, they're a different torque than the majority of the engines. So I'm going to go ahead and use all these printouts that I did to guide myself into torquing everything, because it's a little different way of doing it, but Benz has their own little thing, and that's what I'm going to do, is what they recommend to do. So I'll be torquing the rest of this down and get it assembled here. Now, as I'm putting the bearings in, I have every one of these bearings labeled according to where they were located in the block from when I pulled them out. So theoretically, there should be no issue, because I am reusing the old bearings since they're in good shape yet. And you might have noticed that I'm kind of setting things on the ground and picking them up off the ground. Most places would say big no-no. This is a one-man operation. I have nobody in here that's putting dust and dirt everywhere. I have all the floors mopped and cleaned up perfectly. So there's nothing to worry about when it comes to debris in the shop right now, unless I do something stupid. So as long as I don't do something stupid, I'll be good to go, and we'll have this motor assembled in no time. Now, you'll probably notice I never checked the clearances of the mains on this particular engine. That's because we're using the same bearings, and I marked them in a way that I can't screw it up. And it turned perfectly fine when it was in there. It was never pulled apart before I got my hands on that part of it. So I know that the bearings should have good clearance. So I'm going to go ahead, bolt everything up the way I took it apart. If it spins freely, I know it's going to be good to go. Now, I've also not looked into whether these main bolts are torque to yield or not yet. I will find that out as soon as I go to torque them. If they are torque to yield, I will be pulling them out and replacing them. But for now, what I want to do is just make sure that my clearances are good. And it looks like it spins nicely, so I am not too concerned about the bearings there. Now, the rest of them I will have to check, because I did not pull that part of it apart. This is how it came to me. Okay, so upon further inspection, reading through the instructions here, it does say that the bolts are torque to yield for crank and connecting rods. I knew the connecting rods were. I have those here, but I did not know about the crankshaft yet. It says, a crankshaft, the bearing cap bolts M8 and M10 must always be replaced. Otherwise, there is risk of cracks and fracture. So, I will be replacing those bolts. So for now, I will just leave them snugged up lightly with the impact gun and just keep assembling. And then once I get the replacement bolts here, I'll pull them out and replace them. And other than that, I will just go ahead and continue assembly as it sits. I'll go ahead and start working on Piston Ring Gap. And once the Piston Ring Gap is figured out, which is going to be according to the spec from Carrillo for the performance application that it's going in, I will go ahead and start installing pistons. So, next step, do the piston rings. So I have gone and done the ring gap on pretty much all the rings except for the last two. I saved that for you guys just to show you how I'm going about setting the ring gap on the rings for this thing. So I took one of the old pistons and I put one of the second ring on here, right? And I'm using the second ring so I can center it, and then when I push this down, it'll be flush against that, so it's a parallel or it squares it up, squares the ring up when I push it down into the bore. And so what I do is I take one of these ring packs out, I go ahead, separate the oil ring right away, because obviously there's no ring gapping in that. And then I am on the piston that is for this cylinder, and I'm keeping them in order just in case there's any difference in the bore whatsoever. I'm keeping them in order. What I do is I take the second ring, because they seem to be too big of a gap, and I just go ahead and throw that in the bore next to it, being very careful not to scratch the cylinder bore. I'll square that guy up. And then I will place this other one in here for the bore that I'm actually working on. And the second ring, I always want that one to be a lot more gap, approximately 8 thousandths more gap than, 5 to 8 thousandths more gap than the top ring. That way you don't end up with ring flutter. So I'll take this. This is a dual gap feeler gauge. It has dual thickness. So like this is 18 and this is 20 thousandths here. So what I do is I take and I'm using the 20 thousandths right here, and it's got plenty of slop. So I know the second ring, when I put it in here, is going to be plenty loose, right? So it's just a quick preliminary check on that. Then over here, I'll take and I'll check it. It doesn't even fit the 18 thousandths, so I know I need to open it up. So I'll take this ring over to my ring filer, file it quick, and then I'll show you what I do after I file it. So after I hit it on the filer, I don't want to leave, in case there's a sharp burr here on there, because when I slide it in that bore, it will damage it if I don't take it off of there. This is a diamond file. I'll take this guy and I will set my hand so that I'm doing like this and kind of going around it like this as I file. Not applying very much pressure at all. All I'm doing is just going over top of it real lightly, just enough to clean up any sharp edge that's on there. Square up the ring again, recheck. The 20 almost fits, the 18 is loose. So I'm super close to where I need. All I need to do is fine tune it, just real light touch. So this is just almost a little tight. It holds the feeler gauge. I want the feeler gauge to be able to kind of slide out of there really easy, so I'll hit it one real light time here. And that one was so light I don't feel there's any way it would leave a burr behind, so I'm not even going to deburr this one. Really, really close to where I want to be. There we go. Now it's loose enough to flow or go in and out easy, and it only has a little bit of slop side to side compared to the second ring, which is just a ton of slop. Because this thing has a significant amount more gap, and that's what you want. That way you don't end up with ring flutter. And then I'll take these, I'll put the second ring up next to the piston I'm going to put it on. I have the oil ring sitting here, then I have the second ring and the first ring. That way I can just pick up the piston and oil rings, put the oil rings on, second ring, then first ring. And that's kind of the procedure I take. Then I will go ahead and I will assemble the pistons as need be. These pistons do not appear to have a directional front of engine on them, which is worrying me a little bit. I would think this thing would be pickier than that, so I'm going to dig into that a little bit more. Pretty much all engines I've done have a front of engine part of a piston, except for like Briggs & Strattons, and this is not no Briggs & Stratton, so I'm going to try and look into that better, but there's no obvious markings. Like this one here, for instance, you can see there's an arrow right here, and that arrow means, the front of the engine would be over here, so you would have to lay it, this way, and then I'm sure that this arrow is also supposed to be on the bottom, so this would technically be for the other side, and that would be the front of the engine. And the reason they do that is typically, I can actually see it on this one, I think. The wrist pins are offset. And so because the wrist pins are offset, that offset is for when the crank and rod come around, so that it pushes against a certain side of the piston more than the other side of the piston to keep it center in the bore, just because of the natural momentum of things. So I'm going to look at this piston, compare it to those pistons, and see if there's anything on those. Maybe those aren't offset, maybe they are centered. I have no idea. I'll look into it, figure it out. So I am doing the pistons now. I'm going ahead and throwing the rings and stuff on, getting everything prepared. I was looking into the pistons and the differences between the factory and the aftermarket. And there is a very clear difference, and I can explain why. So, obviously this looks completely different. The big thing, though, is the wrist pin. So, on the factory pistons, the wrist pin location is an offset location. And by that, I mean it's offset to the skirt. So this measures 2.306 roughly, right? And then this is 2.37. So it's like 64 thousandths offset. And then when you go to this one over here, and you do the same measurement, you get 2.33 roughly, and 2.33 roughly. Ends up being the same. So this is a centered wrist pin, and this is a offset wrist pin. Now, why is it like that? Well, if you measure the skirt on this one is 3.816, and the skirt on this one 3.817 at the same spot. So this one is 1/1000th tighter tolerance to the cylinder wall than what this one is. So the reasoning for this thing having an offset skirt is because there's a little bit of slop in the piston to bore clearance, so this thing has a tendency to rock. By doing that, they can take the momentum of the rod as it's coming around, as the crank's doing its swoop. It comes around and it creates a little bit of a swing against one direction, and they can counter that by giving it an offset. That way it pushes the piston up when it's at bottom dead center. So when it comes around like this, right, and it's pushing that way, so this is offset that direction right now, so you'd want it this direction, right? So that when it pushes like this, it pushes the piston up center. And when you have a tighter piston to bore clearance, the skirt to bore clearance, you don't need that as badly. So just a little note I wanted to throw out there on that. I would like to see a little bit of an offset on these, but it's not the end of the world. Let's go to piston rings. Putting the piston rings on here. So obviously I'm going to start with the oil ring. And the oil ring is a 3-piece oil ring. We have this guy here with a split on one end. Go ahead and throw that guy on here. It just goes on really easy. You don't have to worry about bending it. It's pretty springy, has a lot of room. And when you're looking at this thing, you want to make sure that you get the joint so it lands flush against each other. So the bits are like this, not overlapping. And remember where that spot is. So I'm going to put my thumb right there. Keep my thumb over the end of that until I get this ready. And then I want to take the opening here and put it so that's where it is. I'm going to put it offset of that a little bit. And I'm going to start on this end here. And this is the only ring that I'm going to do this to where I do the spiraling it on, because it's such a thin ring. It really isn't going to bend it unless you're an idiot with it. So I'll go ahead and put that guy on there like that. And then that keeps this thing from popping out. Now when I put the other one on, I like to put them 180 off from the other one that I just put on. So I'll go ahead, slide that guy on there like that. And then, of course, you want to make sure you can squeeze it. Right now, it's binding. Oh, it actually popped free. So this guy popped out. So now I have to redo the works and start over here. That's the first one that did that. I did all of them but this one, and now that one does it, of course. Where is... There we go. So I'm just going to pop this down a little bit. I got to get both of those rings out of there. Okay, now that I got the joint sitting where I want it again, let's try this again. This time with a little bit better success, hopefully. There we go. There, that's better. Now I can feel that it's got a springiness to it. So I can go ahead and do the second ring. Now the second ring is what's called a Napier ring. I'm not even going to try and show you on camera, but it has like a little shelf here. So imagine this is the ring, right? And you're looking at the end of the ring that's cut off. it's got a shelf, so it's got like a step in it. You want that step to be downward. It's what's called a scraper ring, so it's meant to scrape the cylinder wall. You want the flush side up, the scraper side down, and normally most rings will have a label on it. This says N200 for whatever reason. It says N200, nitrate 200 or something, I don't know. But it's got an N200 that goes up on this particular ring. Be sure to check the guide that comes with the pistons for which way your rings go on. Now, you will notice I am actually putting this ring on by hand. This is a lower tension ring, meaning it's not very strong. It's very thin. It does not have much material to it. So it's very easy to do this to. Now, you want to make sure you don't overdo that. These can be done by hand fairly easy, but if you get an old school motor where it's got a very thick, high tension ring, they are difficult to do that without breaking. But you don't want to overextend it to the point of where you stretch that metal past its return state. If you're not comfortable with doing that, get yourself a ring separator. There's a special tool that has a pliers that comes out rather than clamps down, and you can use that to install the rings. So there's that portion there. Now, another little side note, as I did notice on these pistons, inside here, there are a couple of holes in here. And on a few of these, I actually had to take this guy and just clean out some, I guess you could call it slag or burrs or whatever. But when they machine them, they left a couple burrs behind. I did all them in this one. I have not done these three yet. This one has a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead, clean them guys out because I don't want any little metal burrs coming out later. Now, those oil holes do come through to here, so you can blow and get it out of there that way. Now, these guys here, these are just a standard C-clip for the piston, and therefore holding the wrist pin in. So I have the one end in. I did all those already on one side only because I still have to put the rod in and put this through. I will be lubing this, of course. When you put these guys in, you want to start this style specifically. You want to start with this guy facing out, and when you put it in there, you're going to push it in like that, roll it down this way. Now, you don't ever want to go this direction because, so if you could imagine, this piston is going up, down really quick, and if it's in there this direction, every time it goes up and down, this thing gets a little bit of weight against it, squishing it like this. Eventually, they could fatigue and let go, come out, pop out of there, then you're going to have a wrist pin against the cylinder wall, cause all kinds of problems. So you always want to make sure that it is this way or 180 from that. I prefer to have it this way because the little notch that's in here allows you to pop it out of there later. And by having it this way, obviously, the weight on it is pushing against this direction. It's not going to make it spring because there's nothing for it to spring against. So, a little side note, something that I've learned. If you have spiral locks, you don't have to worry about that. You just have to worry about your fingers because they will be destroyed by the time you're done installing them. I'm going to go ahead and get all these pistons and rods in. Now, I have somebody verifying at the CP Carrillo company to make sure that is the case before I install them. Once I find that out, I will install them. Now, the rods I do have marked, so I'm going to keep those towards the front of the motor. I don't know that it matters. I don't think these bearings aren't anything specific on one side or the other. Sometimes that will matter because the bearing will have a chamfer on one edge and not on the other edge. And the chamfered edge goes towards the part of the crank that goes to the counterweight, and then the non-chamfered edge would go towards another rod like this. So make sure you pay attention to that as well. Now I'm going to use the old bolts during my time in which I am just checking bearing clearances, and then once I know the clearances are good, I will finalize by putting the brand new bolts that I have because they're torque to yield in this motor. So the last little clip you guys just watched was me talking about the position of these rods and the little mark that was on there. Now you can see obviously I'm in a completely different state of the engine process. I don't even have the pistons on that plastic tray anymore. Interesting little story. So I tried to put the rods in and then slide the wrist pins in, and it turned out that the company that made the pistons had accidentally forgot one very critical process to cut room for the connecting rod to slide in there. So there wasn't quite enough room for that to happen, so I had to send the pistons back. now we are 3 weeks later, I believe, 2 to 3 weeks later. So fairly decent hiccup in the whole process, and I am where I sit now. So we're going to continue. I did put all the wrist pins and rods on. I will explain a couple things quick, but I do have this rod and rod cap off because I'm going to go ahead and get the rings on and get this thing installed in here. So with that, I did notice a couple of things. We have the mark on the rod. I noticed all the rods, the mark lines up with where the AMG and that little mark are, and on the other side there is nothing. So these rods are identifiable on one side or the other, but again, I still don't believe it matters which direction they're in. However, I'm going to continue to put it in the direction that they came out anyway. I have all the oil rings on because those don't matter. I'm going to go ahead and put these rings on and drop this piston into place, and then, I guess I'll just go ahead and go through the whole process. You guys can watch as I drop this cylinder in place, and then I'll skip over all the rest of them and give you guys the next step after that. So, as you can see, I have the one piston and rod in here. I just started at the back. I really don't care where I start. I'll just assemble it as I need to. But I'll just do one side, and then I'll do the other side, and I am using the factory bearings. Now, this crank journal, or all the journals for the crank for the rods, they all measure the same. So, since I didn't replace the bearings and they were good and everything looks like it's wearing out perfectly, it's going to be perfectly fine the way it is. But I do have to replace these bolts. So I will be replacing the bolts. I'm just not going to do it until I get the main studs, which I'm going to be putting in here. This is going to be getting some ARP main studs. And I'm going to replace these bolts at that time. I do have the new bolts sitting right here, but I'm saving that for last because when I torque these down is what I'm going to torque this down. So I'll leave those bolts out, just put these in for the time being, so I can just kind of get everything set up and in the position I need to, make sure all my clearances feel good, everything looks right, everything looks okay, and the way that it should. One thing that I did notice that is definitely different with a allofill style cylinder wall is when I put the piston in, it was very tight going through my ring compressor here. As soon as it went past the ring compressor, the piston just shot down like there was no resistance. I gotta give them credit. This cylinder wall is impressively low resistance. I mean, the fact that I can turn this thing like this with my bare hand is pretty impressive. Usually that'd be a little bit stiff, but it's very, very easy to do. So I'm kind of impressed with that. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of these things installed in here, and then I will bring you guys right back. Before I get too far into this video, we're going to go ahead and cut it right here. It has gone on long enough. As you can see, there is a card here for you to click on. That is going to be for the next video when it comes out. And with that, like, share, subscribe, and as always, I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for joining me.